The dog was named Crow for the black streak that ran from his snout to the tip of his spine like soot dragged through snow. He didn't bark unless it mattered. He'd survived 2 cattle drives, 3 gunfights, and 1 Kansas winter that split barns like old ribs. His master, Wade Coleridge, trusted Crow more than any man he'd met in the war or since. They were 30 miles from the edge of Sundown County when the wind shifted west. Crow's ears twitched. He turned his nose into the dust. Wade, saddle-heavy and sun-chapped, paused mid-swig from his canteen. Crow rarely broke gait unless something was wrong. The dog loped ahead through cactus shade and hardpan. Wade clicked his tongue and urged the mare after him. They passed a rusted fence post long lost from any ranch boundary, a skull tangled in wire, a boot half buried in sand. The world out here was made of the forgotten and the lost. Crow stopped. Wade dismounted slow. His boots landed soft in dust that still held the morning's chill, though the sun was already cruel. Crow whined. She was curled in the shade of a boulder, half covered in earth like she'd been trying to bury herself. Skin the color of wet ash, lips split, hair knotted and matted with blood. Her dress, once pale blue, was shredded from thorns and wind, the hem ragged as a wolf's breath. Wade didn't speak. He crouched beside her and laid the back of his hand near her mouth. There was breath, thin and dry as paper, but breath. Crow sat on his haunches and stared. He got water to her lips. She swallowed once, then convulsed. Dust lifted from her throat in a small cough. She tried to move, failed. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. He hoisted her into the saddle and tied her in place, her arms limp as rope. He mounted behind her and guided the mare toward the foothills, where a half-ruined hunting shack stood hidden behind cottonwoods, a place Wade hadn't visited since spring rains broke its roof. It was better than leaving her for the buzzards. She weighed nearly nothing, a girl who'd been hollowed by something too big for her bones. Crow ran ahead, leading the way like he knew she belonged to something that mattered. By dusk, the shack's door creaked on its lone hinge. Wade set her down on the old cot, tore his shirt into strips for bandages, poured whiskey into her open wounds. She didn't wake but jerked at the sting. He spoke little, cleaned her limbs, picked bramble from her feet. Her ankles were torn, her ribs too sharp. Someone had hunted her or left her for hunted things. He slept near the hearth, one eye open, the rifle across his lap. Crow curled beside her cot, head on his paws, watching her breathe. It was 2 days before she opened her eyes. They were green, not pale but deep, like moss pressed into stone. She didn't speak, just looked at him. He offered her water. She took it and drank in silence. "You know where you are?" he asked. Her lips parted. "No." He waited. She didn't say more. "Name?" She swallowed. "Don't know." He frowned. "You don't remember?" "No." A lie, or maybe not. But Wade had learned long ago that a lie told by a wounded woman was worth hearing out. "You got a mark?" he asked. She blinked. "Tattoo, scar, pendant." She raised her arm and turned it. On her inner wrist, a strange burn, circular, not a brand but deliberate. Wade didn't show his reaction, but something moved in his chest, something cold and old. He'd seen that mark once, long ago, on a folded letter with his name burned into the corner. In another life before cattle and guns and silence, Wade Coleridge had been promised to a girl. A strange arrangement between 2 families. She'd been from East Missouri. Her name was Ruth Vexley, daughter of a glass merchant with debts and dying land. Wade had never met her. Only seen the miniature painted on the back of a letter and the mark branded on the wax seal. A ring-shaped burn, something her mother had used to ward off evil in old ways not spoken in town halls. She disappeared 2 years later, and the marriage was called off. He'd never thought about her again. The girl in the shack healed slowly. She spoke little but watched everything. When Crow left her side to fetch a snake or chase a rabbit, she missed him. Wade saw it in the way her fingers twitched against the cot's frame. She slept with her hands curled like claws. Wade heard her cry out at night, not with words but broken sounds. Names, maybe, or memories she hadn't claimed yet. He didn't press, not yet. One morning she asked, "Why did you stop?" "Crow found you." She looked at the dog, he looked back. "Why didn't you leave me?" "Didn't seem right." "You've done wrong things before." He met her gaze, plenty. She nodded like she'd known that. By the 6th day, she could walk. Wade gave her his old shirt, a belt to tie the fabric into something less wind-torn. She took it with the quiet grace of someone who knew better than to ask for more. "You'll need a name," he said. She looked toward the window. "I like Ruth." He didn't react, just watched her, and the wind flatten her hair against her cheek. "Fine," he said. "Ruth it is." Crow whined. The room fell still. She turned toward the dog and said, not to Wade but to the air between them, "I think I was supposed to find you." Wade didn't answer. Outside, the wind rose. Far off, a bird screamed like it knew what she meant. He caught her once, days later, trying to start a fire with her bare hands, striking stone to stone with shaking fury. Her fingers were blistered, her face hollowed by something he hadn't named. "Who did it?" he asked. Her eyes turned glass. "They thought I was dead." Wade nodded. He'd seen that kind of mistake before. The kind that left a person walking long after their shadow had given up. He let her stay. She helped him repair the roof, fetch wood, boil water. She never asked what he did before this life. He didn't ask what she remembered. But every night he watched her turn the burn mark on her wrist against the firelight like it was a compass pointing somewhere buried deep. And then one night she stood at the door, Crow at her side, and said, "I want to find them." Wade didn't have to ask who. Crow growled low. "I'll need a gun," she added. "You ever shot?" "No." He got up and opened the trunk. The revolver inside had belonged to his father. A Colt Navy, blackened with age. He handed it to her. Her hand closed over it like she'd always known the weight. And Wade knew then. It wasn't chance, not fate, not mercy that had led his dog into that dust. It was the promise he'd never meant to keep. And the reckoning that waited with her name burned into it like blood. She learned to shoot with quiet rage, never flinched at the recoil, never smiled at the sound of bullet hitting tin. Wade set up broken bottles, rusted pots, once even the wing of a scarecrow he nailed to a post. She struck them all within a week. He said little, just adjusted her grip when needed, reminded her to breathe before the trigger broke. She didn't thank him. At night, she'd clean the Colt by lamplight, disassemble it piece by piece until the gun was as familiar as breath. Her hands, once shaking from hunger, grew steady. Her back straightened. She started wearing Wade's old boots, too big but durable, and the coat he'd outgrown in Texas. The collar brushed her jaw like armor. Crow never left her side. They moved together now, scouting creeks, watching sky changes, circling the perimeter like they expected something bad to catch up any day. Wade knew better than to ask when. One morning, they found a rider. Half buried beneath brush, face down, arms splayed. Shot clean through the back, horse gone, buzzards circling in lazy orbits. Ruth crouched beside the corpse and lifted the man's coat. Something in her face changed. She reached into the inner pocket and drew out a coin. Black, flat, etched with a crude symbol, circle over cross, the mark of the Sundown Riders. A group Wade had heard of and never wanted to meet. They weren't outlaws exactly, not soldiers either. Hired knives mostly, killers with no flag, no home, no rules but the one written on their coins, silence for silver, death for gold. She stood and said, "He was one of them." "You remember." "I remember the one who gave me to them." Wade held her stare. "Who?" "My father." She said it plain. No tears, no catch in her voice, just truth, bare and sharp. Crow growled again. The wind changed. They rode south toward Dustwhip, a town choked in salt and bones, where the sundown riders had been last seen. The shack stood behind them, empty as a cleaned grave. Ruth wore the gun on her hip now, her hair tied back with sinew thread, her shoulders narrow but braced. She didn't speak for hours, just watched the land roll by in silence. Wade knew that look. The one you wore when you no longer belonged to the world before pain. Dustwhip rose from the earth like a scab. Half the buildings were burned out. The saloon leaned eastward like it was tired of standing. Wade rode in first, Ruth behind him, Crow underfoot. The sheriff was gone, the post office boarded up. Only the general store had life, dim lamps, 2 horses tied out front, and a girl sweeping the porch like she knew she wasn't welcome on either side of the door. Inside, a man in a gambler's coat looked up from a stack of flour bags. Ruth brushed past Wade and placed the black coin on the counter. "Where's the man who carries these?" she asked. The gambler's eyes narrowed. "What's your stake?" "My name." The man hesitated. Wade stepped forward. "You want to keep your jaw." That was enough. The gambler nodded toward the back room. "Reckon you'll find a map on the wall," he said. "Marked in charcoal. 3rd camp down the Black Ridge. They stay mobile." "They expecting company?" Wade asked. "They don't expect anything," the gambler said. "They just wait." The camp wasn't hidden so much as placed where no one sane would go. The Black Ridge cut deep into the land, sheer walls, scree slopes. Only one trail led to it, flanked by dead trees and twisted iron stakes from some old mine. Ruth walked ahead. She moved like she was returning home. Wade hung back, rifle ready. Crow stayed between them. They spotted the first sentry at dusk. Ruth shot him through the eye, no hesitation, no tremble. The second man died in his sleep, throat slit clean. She took his knife. Wade didn't ask if she'd done it before. They reached the camp's heart by firelight. 6 men sat around the coals. 2 women chained nearby, gaunt and barefoot. A wagon loaded with crates sat in the shadows, one wheel cracked, canvas stained. Ruth stepped into the circle of firelight. The men rose, confused, half reaching for guns. She drew first. 2 fell before they fired. The others scattered. One ran toward the wagon. Wade shot him through the back. Another tried the rocks. Crow leapt and tore his leg out from under him. Only one man remained, staggering toward the fire, hands raised. Ruth aimed. He said Ruth Vexley. Her hand trembled. Wade stepped up. "You know him." She nodded once. He was the one who said I'd be better off this way. The man's face changed. "Your father made the deal." "I know." He smiled crooked. "He's rich now. Sold the land, took the name clean off the rolls. You're dead, girl. You died 2 winters ago." She shot him in the knee. He screamed and collapsed. "I lived," she said. Then shot him in the heart. They burned the camp, freed the women, buried the dead. Ruth stood over the ashes until the sun cracked the horizon, her face unreadable. Wade said nothing. He knew revenge could quiet the past, but it never silenced it. Still, there was peace in her shoulders he hadn't seen before. She looked at him. "I need to find him." Wade nodded. Crow barked once. "St. Ellison," Ruth said. "That's where the land records went. That's where the lies live." Wade saddled the horse. Then we ride. The trail east was long, but she rode without fear. The bride was coming home. St. Ellison sat on the edge of civility like a drunk at a church pew, pretending long enough to get what it wanted. It was rail lines and red sashes, polished boots with blood underneath. The kind of town that bought silence in bulk and buried mistakes out back behind the chapel. They arrived by moonlight. Wade left the horse tied under the sycamores half a mile out. Ruth walked ahead, Crow silent beside her. She wore no bonnet, no gloves. Let them see her face, Wade thought. Let them guess what she remembered. No one noticed them at first. The night was loud with fiddles and poker, girls laughing sharp like broken glass in the saloon windows, but Ruth wasn't heading there. She went to the courthouse. It was locked, of course it was. She didn't pause, drew the Colt, shot the lock off clean. Wade raised a brow. "Subtle," he said. She didn't answer. Inside, the air stank of mildew and old ink. Dust floated like spirits unsettled. Ruth moved to the ledger desk, pried open drawers until she found the deeds. She knew what she was looking for. "Here," she said, held up a folded page. The paper yellowed, but the name was fresh. Jameson Vexley, grantor, Matthias Templeton, buyer, transferred 6 months after her disappearance. Sealed with a notary's emblem that Wade recognized, an old family sign burned from the war, thought to be extinct. She turned the page. There scrawled in the margin in a foreign hand, "Property cleared, heir deceased." She stared at it until her knuckles paled. Then she ripped the page in half. They didn't sleep. Instead, they followed the paper trail across town. Each name led to another: bank manager, land broker, church official. St. Ellison had buried the deal under layers of smiles and scripture. By dawn, Wade had 2 names scratched into his notebook: Templeton and Clive Doran, one rich, one deadly. Templeton owned the land now. Doran had facilitated the exchange. Doran ran the guards, and the guards kept women like Ruth in wagons, in camps, in silence. She found the brothel by scent before they saw it, perfume and pipe smoke, flesh too soft for the cold. A girl answered the door, no older than 15. "I'm looking for Clive," Ruth said. "He don't take visits," the girl replied. "Tell him it's Vexley's daughter." The girl blinked once, then vanished inside. Wade put a hand on Ruth's shoulder. She shook it off. 5 minutes later, Clive Doran appeared. He was tall, with teeth too white and boots too clean. His eyes took her in like she was livestock. "Vexley's daughter," he said, slow. "Didn't expect to see you standing." She didn't move. "You were meant to disappear," he added. "A quiet loss, regrettable but useful." "I remember your hands," she said. "I remember the ring, iron crest, the way you held the gate open when they dragged me out." He chuckled. "Memory's a funny thing." Crow growled. Doran reached for his belt. Wade shot first, clipped his wrist. The pistol dropped. Doran screamed. Ruth stepped forward and slammed the Colt into his knee. He collapsed. She knelt beside him. "You'll take me to Templeton," she said. "Now." The mansion sat west of the tracks, high ground, long windows. Templeton had bought himself the best view of the town's sins. They dragged Doran up the walk like a sack of meat. The butler opened the door and turned pale. "Tell him," Ruth said. Doran, teeth gritted, whispered, "She's here." A few minutes passed. Then the door opened wider. Matthias Templeton stood there in a velvet coat, the same seal on his collar as on the notary page. His hair was white, his eyes hollow. He stared at Ruth like she was smoke rising from the past. "You were a child," he said. "It was business." I'm not a child now. Wade said, you sold her family's land. You signed her death. Templeton looked past them, at the dog, the gun, the eyes full of fire. I can't undo it, he said. No, Ruth replied, but you can pay. She raised the colt. Templeton didn't flinch. He stepped forward. If I'd known what you'd become, he said, I'd have killed you myself. She shot him through the eye. Doran screamed again. Wade hit him across the jaw with the rifle butt. The butler ran. Crow barked once. They left the house burning behind them. Back on the edge of town, Ruth sat beneath the sycamores, the gun across her lap, her face streaked with soot. Wade stood nearby, watching the road. You could leave now, she said. Go back to the land. He shook his head. She looked at him then, really looked. I think you were meant to find me. Crow found you. He led you. They didn't speak again for a long while. At dusk, they headed north, back to the hills, back to the dirt that hadn't been stolen. The war wasn't over. But the ghosts were fewer now. Spring rode in on the back of dust and thunder. Rain came hard, carving gullies through the trail north, flooding the dry rivers with red water. Ruth never blinked at the storm. She rode through it like she belonged to the bones of the world, not its skin. They camped in the ruins of a burned chapel, stone walls blackened, crucifix fallen in two. The pews had been torn up for firewood long ago. Wade built the fire anyway, and Crow curled beneath the altar like it was a den. Ruth knelt by the ruined pulpit, fingers tracing carvings that hadn't burned, names, dates, prayers etched by people long forgotten. You ever believe in God? She asked. Wade threw a log on the fire. When I was a boy, until I learned what men can do with his name. She nodded like she'd expected the answer. I used to pray, she said, in the camp before I forgot the words. Wade didn't reply. She turned, eyes catching the fire's edge. Do you believe in justice? I believe in consequence. She stood, then we'll go to Stonewater next. He looked up. Why there? It's where the child was taken. Wade stood slowly. What child? She took a breath that trembled at the edges. The first night I was dragged from my father's house, there was another girl, younger, maybe 7. They said she'd fetch more coin. She screamed until they stuffed a rag in her mouth. Wade felt something tighten in his ribs. Ruth met his eyes. I left her behind. Stonewater was 5 days northeast, a mining town turned bone pit, once rich in ore, now choked with poverty and black lung. The company guards outnumbered the miners 3-1. Justice had no footing there, but Ruth wasn't looking for permission. She wore her coat tight and her gun loose. Wade kept his rifle wrapped in canvas, but his finger never strayed far from the trigger. Crow walked ahead, hackles raised, teeth bared at every man who looked too long. They found the girl in a shack on the southern rim of the town, behind the collapsed mill. Her name was Elsie. She was 11 now, if that, thin as a wire, eyes too old for her face. She sat on the floor, stitching a sackcloth doll with fingers that had forgotten how to be a child. When Ruth stepped through the door, Elsie flinched. Ruth crouched. I remember you, she said. You had a ribbon, yellow. Elsie blinked. They took it. I know. Are you here to take me back? Ruth's voice dropped. No, I'm here to burn it all down. The man who owned the mine was named Cyrus Hobb. He lived in a house made of brick when everyone else slept in rot. He employed the guards. He bought girls by the wagon load. The town bent around him like a rusted crown. Wade wanted to kill him outright. But Ruth had other plans. She spent the night gathering names, found an old Union man who remembered his fire, found 3 miners who'd lost daughters, sisters, wives. She fed them whiskey and asked them questions no one had dared voice in years. By dawn, they had 20 names. By dusk, 20 men with pickaxes, knives, 2 rifles, and a thirst that hadn't been quenched in a decade. Ruth gave them the time. Just after midnight, when the guards change and the dogs are fed. She didn't promise safety. She promised reckoning. The night burned blue with rage. They came in silence, no shouting, no chaos, just men who remembered what was taken. Wade took the south door. Ruth and Crow circled the stables. One of the miners climbed the roof with a torch and a bottle of lamp oil. The first guard died before he drew breath. The second ran, they let him. Inside, Cyrus Hobb was halfway to his cellar when Ruth found him. She didn't speak, just raised the colt. He begged. She said, "Do you know how many nights I prayed for this?" He offered coin, land, silence. She said she was 7. And shot him through the throat. The fire caught faster than expected. Flames jumped from roof to rafters, catching the oil, the walls, the history. Ruth walked out with Crow at her side, eyes rimmed red, not from smoke, but something deeper, something clean. They left Stonewater at sunrise, Elsie asleep in Wade's saddle, Ruth walking beside the mare. No one followed. The mine burned until nothing stood. A week later, in a clearing by the river, Ruth gave Elsie a piece of leather and taught her how to cut it into ribbon. Yellow. Wade watched from a distance. He didn't speak. He knew the war was changing. It wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about making sure the world that killed Ruth once would never lay hands on a girl like Elsie again. Summer dragged in dry and mean, splitting the land open with heat and hornets. The rivers shrank to threads and the hills went mute. Ruth, Wade, and the girl, Elsie, moved like ghosts through what was left of the country. They slept in abandoned barns, old way stations, under trees still bearing bullet holes from wars no one talked about. Elsie learned fast. She watched Ruth clean the gun, watched Wade mend boots with a patience that spoke of years carried heavy. She never cried, not once, not even when the fever hit her 2 days out of Grayler's Bluff. They waited it out in a root cellar, Ruth laying wet cloths across the girl's brow, whispering things Wade couldn't hear. Crow wouldn't leave the entrance, just lay flat, ears twitching as if something waited above. On the 3rd morning, Elsie sat up. "I dreamed she had wings," the girl said, "but she flew into the ground." Ruth smoothed her hair. "You won't." Wade turned from the doorway. He'd buried others, carried girls smaller than Elsie out of worse places. But this one Ruth had chosen not to lose. They reached Hollow Creek in late July. A small town, mostly farmhands and grave diggers. It didn't show up on most maps. The preacher there was a one-eyed ex-smuggler who married couples for bread and buried them for whiskey. Ruth asked him for a shovel. Not for a grave, for the box. They found it 2 miles north, beneath a dry oak. Wade remembered burying it the year the war ended. Inside, a sealed pouch, a rusted key, and a letter unopened. Ruth broke the seal with her thumb. Wade stood silent while she read. She folded the paper and held it out. "I was promised to you," she said, "signed in my father's hand." Wade took it, read it, then dropped it into the fire. "I don't want a promise made by a man who sold you," he said. Ruth looked down at her wrist, the scarred circle still pale and hard against her skin. "I don't either." In Hollow Creek, they rented a cabin that lined east. Elsie slept on a cot. Wade patched the roof. Ruth worked the fields with her sleeves rolled and the colt tucked under her belt like a warning carved in iron. For a time, things were still. Then one night, as the rain returned after months of silence, Crow bristled at the door. Wade took his rifle. A figure stood in the dark, hat soaked, hands raised. "I ain't armed," the man said. "Name, Marin, I come from south." Ruth stepped beside Wade, eyes sharp. "What do you want?" "I saw the fire at Stonewater, saw what you did, and I got girls missing in my town. 2, maybe 3, taken the same way, I figure. Maybe you're the kind that stops that sort of thing." Ruth said nothing for a long while, just stared at him. Then she nodded once. "You'll have to pay. I don't have coin." "Then bleed beside us." The man nodded. And just like that, the war wasn't over. It was only moving. A year passed. Ruth rode less, but she trained Elsie with flint, with powder, with eyes sharp for lies. She taught her how to track, how to disappear into the world without losing herself. Wade worked the edges of towns, whispering to widows, ex-soldiers, orphans who remembered faces in the dark. They left notes in tree hollows, signals in twine and stone, a quiet army rising from the forgotten. They called it the ash mark, for the brand on Ruth's wrist, for what was burned and could not be rebuilt. One evening, Ruth stood at the edge of the wheat field behind the cabin. The sky was blood orange, wind low. Crow sat beside her, muzzle gray now. Elsie picked flowers near the fence line. Wade leaned against the porch rail, watching. "You ever wonder," Ruth said, "what might have happened if I'd stayed dead?" Wade didn't answer right away. "Then, no." She looked back. "Why not?" "Because you didn't, and everything after that's yours." She turned toward the horizon. "No, it's hers now." And she nodded toward the girl, ribbon in her hair, a knife on her belt, boots dusted with soil. The wind moved like breath across the field. Ruth raised her hand, and Crow followed without command. Wade stepped off the porch. And Elsie smiled, small and strange, like someone who had seen both hell and the way out. The land didn't change, but the people walking it had. That was enough. That was the ending Ruth chose. And she never looked back.